Hey, good morning, everybody. Good morning, everybody. I'm Gina Hendrickson, lead pastor here at First Methodist Church of Moorestown, and I am so grateful that you are here. There will be more people that continue to come in. We have heard that there is an accident, unfortunately, down the road. We're praying for safety and well-being for all who are engaged in that. There's also a major event that's happening in the town. So depending on where you're coming from, there's 2 locations that people are being rerouted from to make their way here. But we are going to honor your time and the agenda for the day, and we're going to continue to move on. But again, we're grateful that you all are here. Here at First Methodist Church, one of our hopes and dreams is to always continue to find ways to reach into the community. And part of that is having events like this, where we're partnering with other people in the community, other groups, organizations, taking strong leadership from within our own church family, and finding ways to connect and help make a difference in people's lives for individuals and families of all generations. So this is going to be the first of many events that we're going to be offering. So I'm grateful again that you all are here. I also want to now just have a brief time to introduce Reverend Dr. Drew Dyson, who is the CEO of the Princeton Senior Resource Center. He is our plenary session leader today. Drew is a dear, lifelong friend of mine and colleague, and is making a difference in so many ways, in so many lives, has a rich understanding of the needs of communities, of people's well-being, of all generations, and we're grateful that he is here to open us for our session today. So will you welcome Reverend Dyson?
All right, good morning. It is good to have an opportunity to be with you this morning. I appreciate the invitation to be a part of this Community Health Day. Jess asked me to talk about the power of community, to share my story of discovering community in the midst of some unlikely circumstances. So I want to have a chance to do that with you today. I'm excited to share that story, look forward to conversations with you, but hope you'll listen with an open heart to what we have this morning. I taught seminary in Washington, D.C. at Wesley Theological Seminary, and one of the traditions at the end of the semester at Wesley, when you're teaching graduate school, your students are all in their mid-20s or beyond, and so I had an opportunity, and one of the traditions at the end of the semester was to invite your professor to come with you out to a bar. And so this happened to be trivia night that my students on the last Friday in May, it was a Friday afternoon course, we went to trivia night on Friday evening in Washington, D.C., and they thought, bringing their professor, they would have a ringer for trivia night. So when we got there, I was excited and looking forward to categories like sports, or maybe if I got lucky, theology and the Bible. That's what they were hoping for. But the first category was text language and emojis. Now, I am the guy, if you ask my children, still uses full capitalization and proper punctuation when I send a text. I do not like to give texts that don't have periods at the end of the sentence or don't spell things out the way they should be. And who knew that fruit and vegetables could be so expressive? Evidently, 20-something young people at a bar in Washington, D.C. knew exactly, but I was no help. But then the next category was art of the Renaissance. Again, sports, like, give me a break here. Art of the Renaissance, no help. The quotable Shakespeare. Now, I love to read, but I never was able to really dig into Shakespeare, and so no help again. And the night went on like that, and they got more and more disappointed that they brought their professor that they thought was going to be a help, but they had a tie with another team, and the tie-breaking category was TV theme songs from the 1970s and 80s. And I was like, yes! I am finally going to be useful to these 20-somethings that have no idea what they're about to see. And the way it worked is they would show a picture on the screen, and somebody from your team had to stand up and sing the theme song, and at least the first full stanza. And so I'm going to help you to practice this with me, because this is how we won trivia night that night. Love, exciting and new. Come aboard, we're expecting you. Right? The love boat. Yeah. And then here's a story of a lovely lady who was living with 3 girls. Yeah. Right? Good. Got it. Here's another one. Just sit right back and you'll hear a tale of a fateful trip that started from this tropic port aboard this tiny ship. And then it goes on from there. And then, my favorite, making your way in the world today takes everything you got. Taking a break from all your worries sure would help a lot. Wouldn't you like to get away? Sometimes you want to go where everybody knows your name. Dun, 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 dun. And they're always glad you came. So for me, a place where everybody knows your name and they're always glad you came is on Wednesday nights. Wednesday nights, I go to a room and I introduce myself every week as Drew from Bensalem. Wednesday nights, I walk into a warehouse in Hackettstown or log on to Zoom from my home in Bensalem with a group of other folks who have become, for me, like my family. There's Phil from Alamucci. There's Bruce and Laura from Byram. There's Susan from Bud Lake. There's Melissa from Mansfield. And we gather together every Wednesday evening without the pretense of titles or the pressure of expectations, just to share experience, strength, and hope with one another. We pray. We engage in deep conversations. We cry together. We celebrate milestones. And we sit in the darkest shadows with one another. These folks have seen me at my best, and they love me at my worst. A few weeks ago, in an online meeting, we had a step meeting where we talked about the 11th step, which is to seek through prayer and meditation to improve our conscious contact with God as we understand God, praying only for knowledge of God's will for us and the power to carry that out. And as we shared together around the Zoom meeting, we shared our stories. It was one of the richest, most rewarding small groups that I have ever been a part of in my entire life. I learned from many others that night about their experience with and their understanding of God. There were Muslims, Jewish folks, Christians, agnostics, and I had the opportunity to share my own story about my relationship with God and how my life has been transformed through that relationship. And it was a powerful evening. Now, I've worked in the church for 30 plus years. I've been a youth pastor, a senior pastor, a seminary professor, a district superintendent, but my experience in this 12-step group has drawn me closer to God and has been a deeper group experience than I've ever had in my career in the church. And I want to share several things that I've learned through this experience. The first one, just as a quick, because this is our Community Health Day, I've learned from this group that self-care is not selfish. Self-care is not selfish. You use the imagery that you have to put on your own oxygen mask when you're on a plane. You put on your own oxygen mask before you help others, right? Because if you can't breathe, you can't be of any help to the person next to you. It always bothered me, especially when I traveled with my children. Like, aren't I supposed to help them first? Like, it seemed ridiculous. But the truth is, if we can't fully breathe ourselves, then how are we expect to help others to breathe? And learning self-care is learning how to say no to people, learning how to set boundaries, learning how to do something fun for yourself on a regular basis, to enjoy the life that God has given you, learning that every minute counts, that even 5 minutes of mindfulness in the middle of a stressful situation can change the whole tenor and the outcome of what's in front of you. Self-care is about living in the moment. It's about learning a phrase that's become incredibly meaningful for me, which is just for today. Just for today. But I've also learned in this group about the power of relationships. The power of relationships to transform our lives. The power of true, authentic community to transform our lives. Now, this sounds like a duh statement from a pastor or a religious leader. After all, we talk about relationships with congregations all the time. We have small groups, we have Bible studies, we preach on the value of relationships, we try to model the importance, we say all the right things. But I can tell you that clergy are no different from anyone else. Let me say that again. Clergy are no different from anyone else. And I believe that one of the greatest enemies for all of us of true mental health and emotional well-being is the threat of isolation. It's a threat of isolation. We know this in the pandemic, right? The pandemic exacerbated a pre-existing condition in our culture, which is isolation. And the pandemic made it even worse. And so we know that in 2018, 27% of adults self-reported feelings of isolation on a regular basis. In 2022, 56% of all adults expressed feelings of isolation, separated from other people, feeling isolated in the midst of that. That's especially difficult, and we've seen the impact on children, youth, and young adults. And we've seen the impact on older adults who have been isolated. There's study after study. I research this all of the time. I'm writing about this all of the time. There's study after study that talks about the impact of isolation and what it does to us, what it does to us emotionally, what it does to us spiritually, what it does to us physically, and the impacts that isolation can have. Depression and anxiety, physical ailments, all stemming from social isolation. But I want to say isolation isn't only about being lonely or being alone. Isolation is really about a lack of authentic relationship. You can be surrounded by people all of the time and be incredibly isolated. And the question I'd love for you to wrestle with today is, do you have 3 people in your life beside your immediate family who you regularly share your true, authentic self with? Do you have 3 people in your life beside your family? Not that you could share with, because many of us would say, oh yeah, I could share with them, I'd feel comfortable sharing with them. But the question is, do you have 3 people that you do regularly share your true, authentic self with? And so for a few minutes this morning, I want to focus on building these kind of relationships for us as individuals, relationships that are about our personal thriving and wholeness. My experience from Wednesday nights over these past 6.5 years, where I'm Drew from Bensalem and nothing more. I'm not Reverend Dyson. I'm not Pastor Drew. I'm not Dad. I'm none of those other titles. I'm just Drew from Bensalem. And what the power of those experiences has done to help me think about healthy relationships. A few years ago, I had an opportunity to go on sabbatical. And I spent the summer immersed in the research and writing of a sociologist named Brené Brown. I know some of you are familiar with Brené Brown. She's an incredible speaker, author, writer. She's a sociologist by trade, teaches in Texas, and she has phenomenal things to say about relationships. And so I immersed myself in all of her writings, and I just absorbed what she had to say. And theologically, I was studying Bonhoeffer the same summer, because Bonhoeffer also talks a lot about the power of relationships. And what I've learned in the midst of that study and that time, and what I've learned in the last 6.5 years, is that relationships that are authentic require 3 things. They require vulnerability, authenticity, and trust. Vulnerability, authenticity, and trust. So vulnerability, Brown defines as uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. Uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. Paul, in Paul's writings, in the letter to Romans in particular, if you are someone who reads the New Testament, talks about our transformed lives, right? And we're very familiar with the passage in Romans 12:1 that talks about our lives being transformed by the renewing of our mind and how God transforms individuals. But Paul also, in the same book, talks about the transformation in relationships when he says, "Bless people who harass you. Bless and don't curse them. Be happy with those who are happy. Cry with those who are crying. Consider everyone as equal, and don't think you're better than anyone else." Right? How to be transformed by relationships with other people. Now, some people, especially in our culture of toxic masculinity, believe that vulnerability means weakness. And there's people, when I even say the word vulnerability, think, oh my gosh, that is definitely not for me. That's weakness. Our instinct is to either protect ourselves or to think that vulnerability is something for other people. Like, I can't be vulnerable, I have to be strong, and we make that the antithesis. But Brene Brown says this. She says, vulnerability is the birthplace of love, belonging, joy, courage, empathy, and creativity. She says it's the source of hope, empathy, accountability, and authenticity. If we want greater clarity in our purpose or deeper or meaningful spiritual lives, then vulnerability is the only path. Not one of many paths, not something you can do, but if you truly want to connect with other people, if you truly don't want to experience this feeling of isolation, then vulnerability, opening yourselves up to others, is really the only path to do that. Because if we're shut down, even if we're surrounded by other people, then there's no transformation that can happen because we close ourselves off to the experience of others. She also writes this. She says, staying vulnerable is a risk we have to take if we want to experience true connection. So the first aspect of these relationships is vulnerability. But there's also authenticity that goes into this. Authenticity. The daily practice of letting go of who we think we are supposed to be and embracing who we are. Letting go of who we think we're supposed to be and embracing who we really are. Or let me put it another way. Letting go of what we think others expect us to be and being comfortable with who we really are. In Ephesians chapter 4, Paul writes this. What this adds up to then, and this is in the Message, what this adds up to then is this. No more lies, no more pretense. Tell your neighbor the truth. In Christ's body, we're all connected to each other. When you lie to others, you end up lying to yourself. And I believe in our culture, there's a lot of going around lying to other people. Everything's okay. How are you? I'm great. Thank you. How are you? Right? We experience that all the time. And I believe this lack of authenticity is one of the greatest dangers in the midst of the church. Even more so than the world. Even more so than in other places. Because if we can't be our authentic, true selves in the midst of the people that we worship with, that we open our lives to in a church, in a synagogue, in a mosque, in any of those religious communities, if we can't be our authentic selves, then we can't really be true to who we are. Andy Root talks about authenticity. He says, theologically, the move from relationships built on influence towards a theology of incarnation, where we embody ourselves with one another. And I wonder how many relationships, again, we have in our lives where we engage in friendship based on seeing and knowing one another. Being seen and being known. And then the last thing is trust. Trust. Charles Feltman writes this. He says, trust is choosing to make something that is important to you vulnerable to other people. Because when you're vulnerable, You have to be able to trust that you're safe. When you open yourself up to somebody else, you have to be able to trust that what you share is safe. Romans 12 puts it this way. In the same way, though, there are many of us, one body in Christ. Individually, we belong to each other. So trust means to choose. Brene Brown writes this: to choose not to connect when the opportunity is there is a moment of betrayal. To choose not to connect when the opportunity is there is a moment of betrayal. Now, who do you think that's a betrayal of? Yourself, your true self. How many times are we in a place where we have a chance to open ourselves up? We have a chance to share something that's real and authentic, but we withdraw to protect ourselves. And what ends up happening is we end up hurting ourselves. We end up betraying ourselves. I was also asked to share a little bit of the story of my own life that led me into the rooms of Nar-Anon in the first place. 6.5 years ago, Nar-Anon, if you're not familiar, is a group for family and friends of those who are struggling with the disease of addiction. And I share this story only with both the permission and the encouragement of my son. As early as 12 years old, we began to struggle with our son and saw signs of an addictive personality. It ran in both Diane and my families. We knew it was a risk. In 2012, he was 14 years old. We left Washington, D.C. We both left ministries and jobs that we loved. I was teaching seminary at the time. And we came back to New Jersey because we were willing to try anything we could to reverse the train that we knew was headed in our direction. And so we came back to a place that was familiar to him to try and make him comfortable. But as Jeremy got older, his struggles continued. Diane and I struggled to figure out what to do, and we struggled alone. We struggled isolated because of our own shame and embarrassment, but also because of the stigma of addiction and the paralyzing expectations, some real and some imagined, that people have for the clergy that serve them and for the people that they sit with in the pews of their congregations. So we struggled alone. As Jeremy went in and out of rehab, progress for short periods of time, followed by intense periods of darkness, we were indeed living a nightmare, all while trying to preach and teach and lead and be a district superintendent in our conference, to fill the role that I was supposed to play. And in the midst of it all, talk about unhealthy, my own tendency towards being a workaholic, pouring myself into my work, became more intense because that was an escape. And I could find health in my work that I wasn't experiencing in other places in my life. So July 6th, 2016, coming up on my 7th anniversary, I made my way into the room where the Nar-Anon meeting was being held for the very first time. 2 weeks earlier, the 25th of June, 2016, we returned from a cruise, a 2-week cruise, with some of our best friends in the world. After dealing with addiction and struggle for the previous 4 years, it was literally for us an escape to paradise. And we had a great time until we started getting closer to the port and our cell phones finally started to get service. You know, if you've been on a cruise, you know what that's like when you start pulling back into the port that your home base is. And we knew something wasn't right. And the anxiety just started to build. We got home that morning at 11 a.m., and the police were there by 11:30. Our son, who had just turned 18 a few weeks earlier, had been arrested and was being transferred to the county jail. And we had to make the hardest and the best decision that we've ever made in our life as parents, which was to leave him in that jail until we could transfer him directly to a rehab. And so for 2 weeks, our 18-year-old son was in the county jail, and we didn't sleep literally for 2 weeks. But we knew it's what we had to do. Well, on June 30th, a week before I actually went in for my first meeting, I drove to the parking lot. I had researched Naranon. I knew that I needed help. I drove to the parking lot, and I parked in the parking lot, and I cried, but I was paralyzed to get out of my car. I couldn't even get out of my car. The emotions of what had I done wrong? Why couldn't I help my son? I helped so many other people. I counseled people dealing with addiction and their families, and I was pretty good at it. I was pretty good at helping other people find the resources they needed. But here I was, a pastor, a leader, and I couldn't help myself. Why had I failed as a parent? Why was I always surrounded by people and yet never felt more alone? And worse yet, what if someone I know or someone who knows me sees me? So I sat in the parking lot, and I pulled out of the parking lot, and I never went into the building. But the next week, July 6th, I went back to the building, and I made it inside. I sat in my chair. I introduced myself as Drew from Bloomsbury, where I was living at the time. I listened. I cried. I listened some more. At the end of the meeting, I was invited to share my own story, and the floodgates just opened up. And after 5 minutes, that seemed to me like forever, I looked up around the room, expecting to see people packing up, getting ready to go, anxious to leave. And as I looked around, I saw tears and empathy and nods of understanding. And I truly felt like for the first time in the midst of this struggle, I finally had a place to belong. So I came back the next week, and the next, and the next. I mostly listened for months, and I learned that addiction was a disease and that I was powerless over it. Addiction is not moral failure. Let me say that loud and clear. For any of you who have someone who's struggling with addiction in your family, addiction is not a moral failure. Addiction is a disease. And an addict is powerless over it. And we, as the ones who love people who are dealing with addiction, are powerless over it. I also learned how to set boundaries and how to move out of enabling and codependent behaviors. I learned about letting go with love and finding hope and serenity, and actually how to find joy again in my life. And I reached out for a sponsor. I connected with Phil from Alamucci, who's become a dear friend of mine. And I began to work the 12 steps of Naranon. Just like any other 12-step program, there's a 12-step for people who love people who are struggling with addiction. And I learned that this program isn't actually about my son at all. The program is about me. And it's about finding hope and finding joy and finding serenity. And I can say that 6.5 years later, my life has been changed. I've learned about progress and not perfection. I'm still working my program of recovery every day, choosing to show up, choosing to build relationships of vulnerability, authenticity, and trust, not only with my group who has become like my family, but also with my family. And I thank God that 6.5 years later, my son is in a very different place. He has triumphs and he has setbacks. But God is still working in his life. And I've never been more proud of this incredible young man. My beautiful boy, who has suffered more in 25 years than most of us have in a lifetime. And I share this because I know how hard addiction can be on families, particularly families who are involved in religious communities of some type, because of the stigma and the shame that's often self-imposed, but real nevertheless. And I share because there was a point where Jeremy and I had an opportunity to share our story together with a group of people, and one of the people that came up to us afterwards was a pastor from another denomination with his daughter who was also struggling, and came up to us and said, "Why do we make it so hard on ourselves by trying to do this alone?" And on the way home, Jeremy said, "Dad, you have to keep sharing our story with the pastors you work with the people in your churches, and with everyone you possibly can, because no one should have to struggle with this disease alone." So I want to just close by saying addiction is a disease over which we are powerless. There should be no stigma to find recovery for an addict or for those who love addicts. And if you are struggling with addiction, or if you love someone who is, you simply need to know that you're not alone. And this morning, coming into this health fair, your struggle may not be with addiction at all. But let me share this. Each of us carries the burden of isolation. Each of us carries burdens in our lives that we shouldn't have to carry alone. And I want nothing more for you than that you find those three people, at least three people, not only who you could share, but you do share your authentic self with. Find that safe space. Find those friends who you will let see you for who you really are. Share your life together and be seen for your true self. Because at the end of the day, after all, making your way in the world today takes everything you got. Taking a break from all your worries sure would help a lot. Wouldn't you like to get away? Sometimes you want to go where everybody knows your name, and they're always glad you came. You want to be where you can see troubles are all the same. You want to go where everybody knows your name.
Can you see why I wanted to invite Reverend Drew Dyson to be our speaker this morning? Friends, my name is Reverend Jessica Campbell. I'm incredibly fortunate to be the associate pastor here, and we might not yet know all of your names, but we are certainly very glad that you have all come and that you all came this morning. My friends, I want to give a special thank you to the two people who have helped me plan this event, Devika Gill and Mary Keppel. Many thanks to them. We have worked quite a bit over the last few weeks, and we hope it's a successful event for all of you who are here. I also want to thank again our plenary speaker, Drew Dyson, for your sharing of your vulnerability, your authenticity, and for trusting us in this moment with your story. So thank you. Many thanks to our lead pastor, Gina, for being here this morning and getting us started. And everyone who is here as a volunteer and greeter, we are so grateful for your coming to help us with this event. I also am very grateful for our session leaders, who I'm going to name one at a time and ask them to stand right where they are just to put a face with the names. So thanks to Doug Sell, who's leading financial health. I'm starting to panic a little bit because I'm not sure they're all here. Lalisi Samuels. All right, she's probably already in the kitchen getting ready for the meal prep session. Mark Morgan, who's here with the play in Moorestown Theater. Anne Lamont, who's here from Moorestown High School and leading Gen Z and Anxiety. Jill Croft, who's leading yoga. All right. And Lilisi just walked in. Lilisi Samuels with Healthy Meal Prep. Also, Cheryl Holliday, who I think may have just stepped out in the hallway. She's leading a session on mental health. Tom Culp, leading spiritual health. And then Katie Clauges and Amanda Swift are dietitians. We are also incredibly thankful to all of the vendors in between session 1 and session 2 in what we call our fellowship hall. We have lots of healthy snacks for you, and then there are a number of vendors who have different things to share with you as well. Apologies, this is our very first time doing this. We have been learning as we go, and we had a few hiccups along the way. You may have signed up for a session on pet health. Unfortunately, our pet health instructor was not able to be with us today. We then tried to make a few frantic phone calls, and we couldn't get anyone to cover that session. So if you've not already, if you did sign up for pet health, we would encourage you to attend a different session. That's totally fine. Just to be clear as well, Gen Z and Anxiety and yoga are only being offered for session 1. So if that's a course you want to take, please attend it in this first block of time. And Mark Morgan with Wellbeing Through Play is only being offered in session 2. So if you signed up for him for session 1, please attend another one and then go to him for the second session. In your packets, we have surveys. This, like I said, is our very first time doing this, and we are hoping to offer it again in the fall on October 21st. And we need to learn how to keep building on this and making it better and stronger. So we would love your surveys and your feedback at the end of the day. There will be friendly greeters to collect your surveys. Don't worry, we'll keep them all anonymous, and we would appreciate your feedback. With that, we have about 10 minutes before our first session begins. There are restroom facilities around the building. In Fellowship Hall, there's water and snacks. And then if you'd like to make your way to your first session, have a great day. Thank you for being here.